My in-laws told me my husband was adopted right before our divorce. You think you know someone. You think you know the man you married, the father of your child. You think you know his family, his history, the very foundation of the life you built together. I thought I did too. Until my divorce, when my in-laws, in a desperate last-ditch effort to win a custody battle, casually dropped a bombshell that would shatter my reality. My husband, the man I was about to legally sever ties with, might not legally exist. And neither, it turned out, did our marriage. The air in the sterile conference room was thick enough to chew. It was the kind of place where futures were diced up and parceled out by people in suits who charged by the hour. My lawyer, a woman named Miss Albright, with a gaze as sharp as shattered glass, sat beside me, a silent fortress of legal jargon and steely resolve. Across the table, my soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel, slumped in his chair, a man defeated. His parents, Robert and Helen, flanked him, their faces a mask of pious concern that I had long ago learned to see through. We were there for another round of mediation, another grueling session in the mud-wrestling match that was our divorce, all centered on our 5-year-old daughter, Lily. The fight had gotten ugly, the kind of ugly where every past mistake is unearthed and displayed like a trophy. Daniel's team was painting me as an unstable, unfit mother, while my lawyer was systematically dismantling his financial history and his pattern of emotional negligence. It was a war of attrition, and I was starting to feel the weight of every battle lost and won. Miss Albright was in the middle of a particularly pointed cross-examination of Daniel's character, referencing a series of missed child support payments and his tendency to prioritize his hobbies over his parental duties. Robert, a man who had always carried himself with the quiet authority of a patriarch, cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the tense silence. He held up a hand, stopping his own lawyer mid-sentence. Helen placed a hand on his arm, her eyes wide with a manufactured, theatrical sorrow. I watched them, a familiar knot of dread tightening in my stomach. They were up to something. This was a performance, and I had a front-row seat. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. He said that perhaps we were going about this all wrong. He suggested that the entire basis of this custody battle, of the divorce itself, was flawed. He looked at me, not with anger, but with a strange, pitying expression that was far more unnerving. He then looked at his son, Daniel, and what he said next didn't just change the course of the meeting, it detonated the very ground beneath my feet. He stated, calmly and without preamble, that Daniel was adopted. The words hung in the air, absurd and out of place. I glanced at Daniel, expecting to see confusion, maybe even anger at his father for bringing up such a private, irrelevant matter in this setting. But I saw none of that. I saw only a profound, hollowed-out shock, the look of a man who had just seen a ghost. It wasn't news to him. It was a secret being exposed, a secret he had apparently kept from me for our entire 12-year relationship. Helen chimed in, her voice trembling, as she explained that it was a private family matter, something they had never seen fit to share. But now, given the circumstances, it felt important. My mind reeled, trying to process the information. Adopted? So what? It didn't change who he was, the man I had married, the father of my child. But then Robert delivered the second, far more devastating blow. He said it wasn't a formal legal adoption. There were no papers. They had simply taken him in. And as the full, horrifying implication of his words began to dawn on me, the conference room started to spin, the faces around me blurring into a watercolor of panic and disbelief. The word adopted echoed in my head, but it was the phrase no papers that had a cold, metallic taste in my mouth. Miss Albright, ever the professional, immediately called for a recess, but the damage was done. The secret was out, festering in the open air of that sterile room. As we gathered our things, the four of them, Daniel, Robert, Helen, and their lawyer, huddled in the corner, their voices a hushed, urgent murmur. I felt like an outsider, a voyeur, peering into a family's private apocalypse. Daniel looked pale, his eyes fixed on the floor, his entire posture screaming of a man whose world had just been irrevocably broken. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him and demand why he had never told me, why he had let me build a life with him under a false premise. But a larger, more terrifying question was pushing its way to the forefront of my mind, a question that made the petty squabbles of our divorce seem like child's play. If there were no papers, if his adoption wasn't legal, then who was he? Who was the man I had married? On the car ride back to my temporary apartment, the city lights blurred into streaks of color through the rain-streaked window. Miss Albright was uncharacteristically quiet, her fingers steepled under her chin. She was thinking, recalibrating, and her silence was more intimidating than any legal threat she had ever made. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, devoid of emotion, which somehow made it all the more terrifying. She explained that this wasn't just a dramatic family revelation, it was a potential legal black hole. If Daniel's birth was never registered with his adoptive parents, if there was no legal trail linking him to them, then his entire identity was built on a foundation of sand. The name on our marriage certificate, Daniel Miller, might not be his legal name. In fact, he might not have a legal name at all. The social security number he had used his entire life, the driver's license, the passport we used for our honeymoon in Italy, all of it could be fraudulent, built on a fiction his parents had created decades ago. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. This couldn't be real. This was the kind of thing that happened in made-for-TV movies, not to me, not to my boring, predictable life that was crumbling into a spectacular, unbelievable mess. I thought back to all the times Daniel had been evasive about his childhood. I'd always chalked it up to a strained relationship with his parents, a common enough story. He'd say things like, "They're just private people," or "It's a long, boring story." I had never pushed. I had never imagined that boring was a code word for non-existent. The car pulled up to my building, and I just sat there, staring at the rain. My divorce was no longer just about dividing assets and arranging visitation. It was about questioning the very legitimacy of my marriage, my family, and the last decade of my life. The man I was divorcing, I was beginning to realize, might be a ghost, and I had been living in his haunted house. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity and sleepless nights. My apartment, once a sanctuary from the chaos of my failing marriage, now felt like the command center for a bizarre and terrifying investigation. Miss Albright was a woman possessed, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She had a team of paralegals working around the clock, trying to untangle the mystery of Daniel's existence. The first step was to confront him directly, but he had gone completely dark. He wasn't answering his phone, and his parents' house, the only other place he could be, was a fortress of silence. Their lawyer had sent a terse message stating that they would not be making any further comments, and that all communication should go through him. It was a classic stonewalling tactic, but this time it felt less like a legal strategy and more like a desperate attempt to bury a secret so deep it might never be found. I spent hours poring over old photo albums, searching for clues in the faded pictures of Daniel's childhood. There were the usual snapshots: a gap-toothed boy on a bicycle, a sullen teenager at a family barbecue, a young man in a cap and gown. But the more I looked, the more I noticed. There were no baby pictures, not a single one. No photo of a newborn swaddled in a hospital blanket, no picture of Helen cradling an infant. The earliest photo of him was as a toddler, already walking and talking, a look of wary uncertainty in his eyes that I had never noticed before. It was as if he had simply materialized in their lives at the age of 2, a fully formed person with no past. Miss Albright's team hit their first dead end almost immediately. They tried to pull Daniel's birth certificate using the information on our marriage license, but the state records office came back with a "no record found." They tried his social security number, and while it was active and linked to his employment history, the original application was missing, lost in a fire at a regional office in the 1990s. A convenient excuse that set off all of Miss Albright's alarm bells. It was becoming increasingly clear that if we were going to find any answers, we had to go to the source, Robert and Helen. We arranged a meeting, this time just the four of us, me, Miss Albright, Robert, and Helen, at their sprawling, immaculate home in the suburbs. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken history. Helen served us tea, her hands trembling so much that the cups rattled in their saucers. Robert did most of the talking, his story a carefully constructed narrative of love and desperation. He claimed they had been unable to have children of their own, and that a distant cousin, a girl who had fallen on hard times, had come to them pregnant and scared. She had given birth to a baby boy, they said, and asked them to raise him. She didn't want any official involvement, just a clean break. They had agreed, out of love for the child and a desire to help their cousin. They named him Daniel, raised him as their own, and never looked back. It was a touching story, a story of compassion and family. But as Miss Albright began to poke holes in their tale, the lack of a name for this cousin, the absence of any hospital records, the sheer impossibility of registering a child for school without a birth certificate, their story began to fray at the edges. Helen grew more and more agitated, while Robert became defensive, his voice hardening. He insisted they had done what they thought was best, that the past was the past and had no bearing on the present. But we both knew it did. It had everything to do with the present. As we left their house, Miss Albright turned to me, her expression grim. She said Robert and Helen were lying, or at the very least, withholding the most critical pieces of the puzzle. And she had an idea of where we might find the truth. It was a long shot, a needle in a continent-sized haystack, but it was the only lead we had. We were going to try and find the hospital where Daniel was born. The lead was a fluke, a throwaway line in Robert's rambling, emotional confession. He had mentioned a small town in rural Pennsylvania, a place where Helen had grown up and where they had been living at the time they got Daniel. It was a name he had said with a hint of nostalgia, a detail he probably thought was insignificant. But to Miss Albright, it was a starting point. Her team immediately began cross-referencing hospitals in that area from the approximate year of Daniel's birth, which we had calculated from his supposed age. It was a tedious process, a digital search through decades-old records. Most of the small community hospitals from that era had either closed or been absorbed into larger healthcare systems, their archives scattered or lost. We were chasing a ghost, trying to find a paper trail for a man who didn't officially exist. Days turned into a week, and the pressure was mounting. The custody hearing was fast approaching, and without a legal identity for Daniel, the entire case was in a state of unprecedented limbo. I felt like I was living in a parallel universe, one where the basic rules of reality no longer applied. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, and look at the framed photo of Lily and Daniel on my nightstand. The man in the picture, the man with his arm around our daughter, felt like a stranger. Who was he? What was his real name? Did he even know? Then, a breakthrough. One of Miss Albright's paralegals found a record from a small, now-defunct hospital that had been digitized before its closure. It was a birth record from the right year, but the name on it was not Miller. It was a different name entirely, a name I didn't recognize. The mother's name was listed, but the father's was marked as unknown. Most importantly, the record indicated that the baby had been released to the care of a Helen Miller, but there was no father listed, no adoption paperwork, no legal transfer of custody. It was just a notation, a single line in a logbook that had been sitting in a dusty basement for 40 years. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and Miss Albright was a master at pulling threads. We immediately filed a motion to compel the release of the full original record, a request that was met with fierce opposition from Daniel's legal team. They argued it was an invasion of privacy and irrelevant to the divorce proceedings. But the judge, a no-nonsense woman who had seen it all, was intrigued. She had never encountered a case like this. She granted our motion, and a court order was issued for the hospital's successor to release the file. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear and excitement. We were on the verge of something, a truth that had been buried for a lifetime. A few days later, I received a call from Miss Albright. The file had been released. She had it in her possession. She asked me to come to her office immediately. The drive over was the longest of my life. My palms were sweaty and my mouth was dry. I was about to open a Pandora's box, and I had no idea what would fly out. I walked into her office, and she gestured for me to sit. She pushed a thin manila folder across her desk. Inside was a single, photocopied sheet of paper. It was the original birth certificate. And as I looked at the name typed in faded ink under the word mother, I felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a name I recognized, but not from any story Daniel had ever told me. It was a name I had seen only once before, in an old photograph of Helen's, tucked away in the back of an album. It was the name of her younger sister, a woman who, according to family lore, had run away as a teenager and was never heard from again. The name on the birth certificate burned itself into my memory. Eleanor Miller, Helen's sister, the woman who had vanished. The pieces of the puzzle, once a chaotic jumble of lies and half-truths, began to snap into place with a horrifying clarity. Robert and Helen's story about the distant cousin was a complete fabrication. The truth was far more sordid, far more tragic. Helen's own sister, Eleanor, had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. In the small, conservative town where they lived in the late 1970s, this would have been a deep, shaming scandal. So they had hidden her away. And when the baby was born, they had simply erased Eleanor from the equation and claimed the child as their own. They hadn't adopted him, they had stolen him, not from a stranger, but from their own flesh and blood. They had given him their last name, raised him as their son, and buried the secret so deep that even Daniel, the child at the center of it all, had never known the truth. His own mother, the one he had known and loved his entire life, was his aunt. And his real mother, Eleanor, had been written out of her own story. The implications were staggering. My marriage to Daniel wasn't just complicated, it was a legal nullity. We had applied for a marriage license using a name and a birth date that were, for all legal purposes, fictional. The man I had stood at the altar with and pledged my life to was not who he said he was. He was the son of a woman who had been erased, a living, breathing secret. The shock gave way to a strange, aching sadness. I thought of Daniel, of the quiet insecurity that had always lurked beneath his confident exterior. He had never felt like he truly belonged, and now I knew why. He had been living his entire life on a foundation of a lie so profound that it had shaped his very personality. My anger at him for not telling me began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of pity. He was as much a victim in this as I was, perhaps even more so. Ms. Albright was already 10 steps ahead, her legal mind racing through the ramifications. She explained that we now had grounds to not only challenge the validity of our marriage, but also to question Daniel's legal standing as Lily's father. Without a legal identity, he had no legal rights. It was a nuclear option, one that could effectively erase him from his own daughter's life. The thought of it made me sick to my stomach. As much as I was fighting him in the divorce, he was still Lily's father. He was the man who had taught her to ride a bike and comforted her when she had nightmares. He was her daddy, in every way that mattered. But the law was a cold, uncompromising thing. We had to present this new information to the court. The custody battle was about to become something else entirely, a legal battle over a man's very right to exist. As I left Ms. Albright's office, the weight of the truth pressing down on me, I knew that the next time I saw Daniel, it would be different. I wouldn't be looking at my estranged husband. I would be looking at a man whose entire life had been a lie that I was now holding in my hand. And I had no idea how or any of us would ever be able to recover from the truth. The courtroom was packed, a testament to the bizarre and sensational nature of our case. The media had gotten wind of it, and the story of the ghost husband had become a local sensation. Ms. Albright presented the evidence with the precision of a surgeon, laying out the timeline of the deception, the lack of a legal birth certificate, and the bombshell revelation of the birth certificate naming Eleanor Miller as the mother. Daniel sat at his table, his face a mask of utter devastation. He looked smaller, broken, the confident facade he had always worn completely stripped away. His parents, Robert and Helen, were called to the stand. Under oath, their carefully constructed story crumbled. Helen wept, claiming she was only trying to protect her sister and her son. Robert was defiant, his patriarchal authority crumbling into a pathetic display of self-pity. He insisted they had done the right thing, that they had given Daniel a good life, a life he never would have had otherwise. But the evidence was irrefutable. They had committed a fraud, a deception that had spanned decades. The judge listened, her expression unreadable, her gaze shifting between the weeping Helen, the defiant Robert, the broken Daniel, and me. The most painful part of the hearing was when Daniel took the stand. He spoke in a hollow, monotone voice, confirming that he had no knowledge of his true parentage until his parents had dropped the bombshell during our mediation. He described the feeling of his entire identity shattering, of looking back at his life and seeing it as a movie he had starred in but hadn't written. He spoke of the love he had for his parents, a love now tainted by betrayal, and the love he had for our daughter, Lily, the only real thing in his life. It was a raw, heartbreaking testimony, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he was not the villain in this story. He was a casualty. The judge adjourned the court for a week to consider her ruling, a week that felt like an eternity. The legal ramifications were immense. Our marriage was declared void ab initio, meaning it was considered to have never existed. I was, in the eyes of the law, never married. This threw the entire divorce proceedings into disarray. There were no marital assets to divide, no spousal support to be considered. It was as if the last 12 years of my life had been legally erased. But the most pressing issue was Lily. The judge had to make a ruling on custody, and she was facing a legal precedent. How do you award custody to a father who legally doesn't exist? During that week, Daniel reached out to me. He called late one night, his voice thick with emotion. He apologized, not for the divorce, but for the lies, for the secret he had kept, even though it wasn't his to tell. We talked for a long time, not as warring spouses, but as two people caught in the wreckage of a shared tragedy. We talked about Lily, about how to protect her from the storm that was raging around us. It was the first real conversation we had had in months, and it felt like a small, fragile truce in a long and brutal war. When we returned to court for the final ruling, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in months. Whatever happened, we would face it. We would do what was best for our daughter. The judge entered the courtroom, her face solemn. She had a decision, one that would redefine all of our lives. The judge's ruling was as unprecedented as the case itself. She began by acknowledging the unique and tragic circumstances, emphasizing that while the law was clear, it had to be applied with compassion and a focus on the well-being of the child. She formally annulled our marriage, stating that it was void due to the lack of a legal identity for the party known as Daniel Miller. Then, she turned to the matter of custody. She acknowledged that Daniel, in his current legal state, had no more right to custody than a stranger off the street. However, she also recognized that he was, in every biological and emotional sense, Lily's father. To sever his relationship with her would be to punish a child for the sins of her grandparents. Her solution was both complex and elegant. She granted me sole legal and physical custody of Lily, providing her with the stability and security of a legally recognized parent. But she also granted Daniel, who she now referred to only as the biological father, extensive supervised visitation rights. The supervision was not because he was deemed unfit, but to provide a legal framework for his interaction with his daughter until he could establish his own legal identity. The judge ordered Daniel to begin the lengthy and difficult process of legally establishing himself. He would have to apply for a new social security number, a legal name change, and essentially build a legal identity from scratch, using the birth certificate we had found as his foundation. It was a long road ahead, but it was a road. It was a chance for him to become a real person in the eyes of the law and perhaps in his own eyes. In the months that followed, we all tried to pick up the pieces. Robert and Helen, their reputation in tatters and facing potential legal charges for fraud, retreated from public life, their family shattered by the secret they had kept. Daniel, now legally going by the name he chose for himself, a name that was his and his alone, began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. He got a new job, a small apartment, and started seeing a therapist to unpack the lifetime of trauma he had endured. Our relationship was no longer a marriage, but it was something. We were co-parents, united by our love for Lily and the shared, bizarre history that bound us together. He saw her every weekend, their supervised visits slowly becoming less about legal oversight and more about a father and daughter reconnecting. I watched him and I saw a change. The haunted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. He was no longer living in the shadow of a lie. He was building a new life, one brick at a time. As for me, I found a strange sense of peace. The divorce had torn my life apart, but it had also torn away a veil of deception I never knew existed. I was no longer the wife of a ghost. I was a single mother, a woman who had faced an unimaginable truth and had come out the other side stronger and more resilient. One afternoon, I watched Daniel and Lily playing in the park, their laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. He was just a dad, pushing his daughter on a swing. It was a simple, ordinary moment, a moment that had once seemed lost forever. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a strange, complicated, and often painful journey. But as I stood there, watching the two people I loved most in the world, I knew that we had found our way to a new beginning. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was the one we had earned. And it was real.